Hey y'all, welcome back to our series on common mistakes authors make when pitching podcasts and how to fix or avoid them. This is Book Marketing Mania and I'm your host, Kim Stewart. And last week we talked about the common mistake of making your pitch all about you and how to fix it by making it all about the listeners and the value you bring to both them and your host. So today, let's talk about common podcast pitching mistake number 6. Your brand confuses the host. When your host receives your pitch, they're going to hop over to social media, to your podcast, to your website, and check you out. Will they see who you say you are in your pitch matches up to who you say you are online? We don't want to confuse our hosts because they're very busy and we don't want to put extra work on them to determine whether or not we are a fit as a guest on their show. So today I'm sharing how we can fix or avoid that common mistake. So let's get to it. So when a host checks you out online, they're going to see, do your values line up with theirs? Do your social platforms show that you're an author and your content reflects who you are serving and how? If you're a fellow podcast host, is your show visible on your platforms? If you're an author, is your book easy to find on your website? We don't want to confuse a podcast host. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to read your pitch and say, yes, I'd love to have you as a guest on the show. So let's fix or avoid the mistake of confusing our host by showing up online as the trusted resource we say we are. So on your website or social media, update it to reflect who you are and the message you have to share. Mention in your bio if you're an author. If you've been in the media, display that proudly on your website or on your social feed. Show some videos on your website or your social feed so a host can see and hear you. My friend Ren Robbins, podcast coach extraordinaire, was my guest on episode 35. And Ren hosted the popular Friends of a Feather podcast for years and said before she accepts guests, she would go to their social media and do a deep dive and see if there's anything that's negative and watch or hear them speak on video in their feed or stories. And speaking of your online presence, also think of what it looks like before you even send your pitch. As you're building relationships online, like we talked about before, new connections will click your bio, and how cool would that be for them to see your book mentioned long before your launch? I love that my friend Rebecca George, host of the Radical Radiance podcast, did that. I can't remember when, it's been so long ago, but her book releases in April of 2023, and it was probably over a year ago that she added that to her bio. So a prospective host might see that and think, I want to go ahead and get Rebecca on my calendar because hosts are batching interviews way ahead of time of their release date these days. And speaking of Rebecca, I'm so thrilled she's going to be my guest on the podcast soon. We're going to have so much fun and talk about podcast guesting and hosting and some beautiful encouragement from her new book, Do the Thing. So be sure and follow the podcast here in your podcast player so you don't miss an episode. The other thing I want to mention about your brand and online presence is that it makes it so much easier for others to recommend you to podcast hosts. I have hosts reaching out to me all the time asking if I can recommend guests on specific topics. And so I just quickly think and can quickly respond and give them links to a potential guest website or social because I know that's what their expertise is and how they show that online. So take time to review your online presence and your podcast pitch to make sure you avoid the common podcast pitching mistake of confusing the podcast host with your brand. We want them to read your pitch and check you out and quickly say, yes, you are the next best guest for my show. And if you're ready to get started, grab my free video training on 5 steps to jumpstart your podcast pitching, and I'll link it here in your player, or you can head to bookmarketingmania.com to sign up. And if you need a second set of eyes on your brand and online presence or some one-on-one help with your podcast pitching plan, I'd love to work with you. You can book a call with me at bookmarketingmania.com, and I'll also link it here in your player. And next week, we'll tackle common podcast pitching mistake number 7, not sharing your speaking experience in your pitch. And I can't wait to help you fix it. See you next week.